Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a lovely, warm day here in suburban Chicago. The end of July is upon us, and we are sweating. I waited a little too long, so I'm going strolling at about 10 a.m., which means I am going to be hot by the end of this walk. But that's okay, because I enjoy going on a walk and talking to you about board games. Well, regular listener Chris Hickman reached out and asked if I was going to do another episode of 400 Back, which I was planning to do, but honestly hadn't put it in the schedule yet. And so when he said that, I'm like, yep, for Friday. Here it is, recording for Friday. This is going to be a regular feature if I can get my act together, at least, in which about once a month I will look back at whatever episode I produced 400 episodes ago and sort of comment about what happened in that episode. In prep for today, I did not actually get a chance to listen to that episode, oopsie doops, but I did write down what happened in that episode. I went and looked at the show notes, and so we're just going to go from there and see how it goes. So this is 400 Back. 4 years ago, I was producing episode 54, and that was the episode. It was part of my top 50, my first top 50 here on the podcast, and it was numbers 20 through 11. So what I'll be talking about now is what I thought of these games then, what I think of them now, and where they are in my top 50 now. As a reminder, for those of you new to the podcast, I do a top 50 list every other year as part, usually at the end of the year, or in this case, it was the beginning of this year. So if you go back and look at the episodes from the end of season 4, because we're in season 5 now, if you go back to look at the episodes from the end of season 4, like 498, 499, maybe 500, somewhere in there, I have my latest top 50. Broken up into 4 episodes, I think, which is a weird way to break it up, but that's how I did it. So, so let's just work our way backwards, and we'll talk about the game and the games and where they are and so on. So number 20 in my top 50 of 2017 was The Arrival. The Arrival is a Martin Wallace game that was produced. It was not a Tree Frog game, but it was produced in the Tree Frog era, and it feels a lot like a Tree Frog game. When you look at it, the pieces are all sort of like little discs and cubes and tiny chits, and it's pretty simple in its production. It's nice enough. I mean, it's not glamorous or anything, but most of the games in the Tree Frog era were not snazzy. The art on this game is beautiful. It's these sort of giant, with these giants emerging out of the mist in the water. The premise of the game is that you are one of the prehistoric tribes of Ireland, and the Fae people are coming out of the ocean and sort of invading Ireland. And so your goal is to become the king of Ireland, and you can do so by using the Fae influence to help you take control of the board. However, if too many people use the Fae influence, you've sort of made bargains with the devil there, and then the Fae take over, and the winner of the game is the person who has the least Fae obligation, or sort of the person who used the Fae the least. So it's got this interesting thing that he toyed with in 2 games, as far as I'm aware of, where you kind of make a deal with the devil, and if things tip over a certain tipping point, then making the deal with the devil ends up screwing you over. The other one like that is Moa, which I never actually played yet. It's still on my unplayed list, I believe. Or maybe we played it, I think maybe I played it once, I don't know. I think we almost played it. Talking about it makes me want to get out The Arrival and play it again. It is a neat game, if a little bit fiddly. Probably the sort of game where once you've played 2 or 3 times, it's pretty fun, but the first play is a little clunky. Then again, I'm a much more experienced gamer now. When I went to play, I bet if I went to play it now, I would find it not really that complicated. I remember last time I played A Study in Emerald. When I first got A Study in Emerald, I thought of it as super complicated. Last time I played Study in Emerald, I found the teach actually pretty easy. So I'm not sure what that says about me or the hobby. So The Arrival is still in my collection. It's a Martin Wallace game, so it would have to be pretty bad for me to get rid of it because I sort of collect those, but it is not in my top 50 anymore. That's The Arrival from Martin Wallace. I have the original European edition, which I got Actually, as a gift from Patrick from Blue Peg Pink Peg, which was super nice of him. The modern American, or the edition that you could buy right now if you wanted to buy it, is essentially the same game. It just has a different cover, which I think is not as good. Maybe a better rule book though. That's The Arrival. All right, my number 19 on my original top 50 was the Legacy, The Gears of Time. Legacy Gears of Time is a competitive Euro game from Floodgate Games, the first game from that company. They went on to make Sagrada and Decorum, I think is their most recent one. It was designed by Floodgate Games' original designer and owner and founder, Ben Harkins. In this game, you are fighting with the other players to control the development of technology through time itself. You have the ability to travel back in time. And the thing is, the time machine that you have only allows you to go backwards in time. I guess. It's a little unclear, but sort of the way the game works is you have this grid of technologies, and then you have this element of ownership of the technologies. And as you travel back in time, you're going to put ownership cubes on those technologies, and then any technologies that get played later that depend on those earlier technologies, you now benefit from those later technologies because you own them. As I think about it now, obviously I wouldn't have reflected on this then because that game didn't exist then, but as I think about it now, the Isaac Childress heavy Euro game Founders of Gloomhaven also had this mechanism. In Founders of Gloomhaven, if you're the first one to get a certain kind of technology, then when later people make that technology, they depend on yours and you get credit for the later technologies that they make. The big thing in Legacy Gears of Time is that it's played in a series of rounds, and when you go back for the next round, you then also put influence down on technologies again. And you can, if technologies don't have any influence on them, they end up going away, and then later technologies don't work. It's this weird sort of ebb and flow. It's a really interesting game. I like it a lot. I've played it a couple times, but not really very much since then, just through the churn of games. This definitely goes in the category of I want to play this again. I really do like this. I hold it in high esteem, but it is no longer in my top 50. So that is Legacy Gears of Time. Ooh, we had a delivery person with some hip hop music playing pretty loud in their van, and they drove off pretty fast. So hope they don't hit anybody. Number 18, Dungeon Lords. Dungeon Lords is an excellent heavy Vlaada Chvátil game, sort of pairs in artwork and theme with Dungeon Pets, which was the follow-up. I think Dungeon Pets is a far superior game, although Dungeon Lords is really interesting as a gameplay experience. It definitely feels a bit older. It's a little more fiddly. It's got this interesting, predictable combat mechanism, which Chvátil would use again in something like Mage Knight, where you can always see what's going to happen to your warrior and the enemies that you're fighting. There's no chance in the battle. Dungeon Lords has the same thing. You can see where the enemies are going, what kind of enemies they will be, and what's going to happen to them when you encounter them. The tricky part is trying to interact with the other players in a way that's going to give you the advantage as you're choosing the different objects that you're going to pursue. In particular, the placement mechanism in Dungeon Lords is fascinating. In this game, you're going to put out your work, you're going to place your workers, and you put them out on your board, and then you deploy them, and you have to deploy them in order. And the order they get deployed in, sometimes, but not always, it always determines when they're going to get played, but some of them get played early, some of them get played late. So you get this interesting mix of things where sometimes you're going to deploy early, sometimes you're going to deploy late. It's pretty interesting. So that's Dungeon Lords. Next up we have Cfall. Dungeon Lords, also not in my top 50 anymore. I do enjoy this game. I don't think it's a top 50 game for me. I also don't own it. Next up is Cfall. I really enjoyed Cfall. We played it 3 times, and then the couple that it was a 3-player game we were playing as a legacy game. The couple that I was playing with dropped out. So I'm not sure if I'll ever get to finish it. My friend actually did say, I'm going to get rid of my copy of Cfall. Do you want it? And I said yes, and I took it. So maybe at some point we'll resurrect the campaign and try to get through it, but I just don't know how we would do that unless somebody was really interested. So at some point maybe I'll declare the game dead and tear it out for parts and get it out of my collection. But for now, I still have it. I'm still clinging to the hope. I remember that the sort of Euro pirate game part was interesting, but not amazing. And it was the story that was really compelling. I hear the narrative gets pretty cool as the game goes along, but, we didn't get that far. So that is Cfall from Rob Davio and Plaid Hat Games, and is not in my top 50 anymore. And finally, the bottom half of this 400 back is Terraforming Mars. Terraforming Mars is, of course, a fascinating, I don't know what you call it, tableau building game in which you're building an engine of cards that give you a variety of different benefits and negatives, but then you also use that to construct areas on the board of Mars and to gain points through just a ton of different options. I really like Terraforming Mars. It is a favorite of mine. It's only grown in my estimation. I have all the expansions now, though I haven't played with Colonies or Turmoil yet, but I keep buying the expansions so that I'll have them. I do not like Ares Expedition nearly as much. If I'm gonna play Terraforming Mars, I wanna play Terraforming Mars. Otherwise, I'll play Race for the Galaxy. Between those two games, I don't need Ares Expedition. No, thank you. And like I said, it's only grown in my estimation. Terraforming Mars was number 11 on my last top 50, as opposed to being number 16 on my top 50 4 years ago. So that's Terraforming Mars, number 16. All right, my number 15 game in this list was Orleans. Orleans is another game I've talked about quite a bit here on the podcast. It's seen a renaissance in my game playing in the last couple years. I've played it several times. I think I had it in my top 50 last year, although we only earned my 10 for 10. I think we only played 4 or 5 times. Maybe not even that. But it is a game that I really enjoy, and I've been playing it a bit more. I did buy the Invasion expansion, and I also got Orleans Stories for Christmas, so I'm really hoping that I'll get those played. I may have to just really push hard to have that happen, bring the game to toggle regularly or something. But yeah, I like Orleans a lot. I still don't quite like it as much as Altiplano, but I find that it is a bit more accessible and a bit more popular. So it has stayed in my gaming. Interestingly, this is the game that feels most settled in terms of my interest, because while Terraforming Mars went up 5 spaces, Orleans went down 2, only 2 in in the most recent top 50. Orleans was my number 17 game, and 4 years ago it was my number 15 game. So either I assessed it very skillfully a couple years ago, or who knows what. But yeah, so that's Orleans, my number 15 from Reiner Stockhausen. And DLP Games is the publisher. I'm not sure who picked it up. I know it's being republished now, maybe Capstone. It was Tasty Minstrel Games when I bought it, but it is not them anymore because they've gone out of business. Next up is one of my favorite games that I never play. I think is really interesting and fascinating. It's definitely a game I want to play again. Man, it makes me, doing these lists is cruel to me because it makes me want to play all these games, and who's got time? And this is Elysium. My number 14 4 years ago was Elysium. This is a game that stayed in my top 50 up until the most recent round. The most recent round, it did bump down. The main reason is not the quality of the game, but how hard it is to get out and teach. It actually isn't that hard to teach, but it is difficult to play and very slow because there's tons of cards. And anytime you're going to play, you have to, each round, this new block of cards comes out, and you have to look at all the cards and figure out which cards you want. And the thing is, all the cards do different things. So you have to look at all the cards and think about them. And so it is a very crunchy game, but it's got this, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, I'm sure I have, go, look at the Elysium tag on today's show notes and you'll see all the episodes where I've talked about it. But as a reminder, it's got a very clever action selection mechanism where you have these 4 pieces, they're called pillars. Guess what shape they're in? And on your turn, you're gonna take one of those pillars and spend it by setting it aside. When you spend it, on your turn, you're going to collect a card from the display. I'm walking by the farmer's market this morning, very busy, it's bustling. When you collect the card from the display, in order to take it, the card in the corner has little colorful icons, which indicate the 4 different columns I was talking about. In order to take the card, you have to have the column that matches the colors in the card. And then after you take that card, you can pick any of the columns you have whether you use that column or not to buy the card, and set a column aside. So each round is 4 turns. Each round you're setting aside 1 column each time. But the big trick is you want to manage your columns so that you're able to take 4 broad cards, because there are these sort of generic cards that you can take if you're unable to take a card because you don't have enough the right columns. But that's usually bad. Your better play is to be able to take cards every turn, and in order to do that, you need to manage these columns. It is a really clever card selection mechanism. I have not seen any other games use it, but I love it. It's great. And that's Elysium. That's also the game that put me onto designers Matt Dunstan and Brett Gilbert. They designed Elysium. It's fantastic. That was my number 14 at the time. I still think very highly of it. I never get it played, and so it has dropped off my top 50. But I suspect if I made an effort and got it played a few times, it would be back in my top 50. We'll see. So that was Elysium. My number 13 4 years ago was Tricarion, Legends of Illusion. In part, I just hadn't played it very much yet. I really liked it the one time I played it, but I had not played it several times. And at this point, I'd say I've played it several times. I don't know if I've got 10 plays under my belt yet, but it's probably close to that. It's a long game, 3 to 4 hours, and so you don't get it played all that often. But when you do, man, it is just a crunchy delight fest. I've talked about it quite a bit. You can go look up Tricarion in one of the many other places I've talked about it, but it is a brain-burning, fantastic game. It's put Minecraft games on the map and made me an utter fanboy of them. So I'm happy to play that whenever I get a chance. That's Tricarion. It is now in my number 6 in my top 50, so it has gone up dramatically from 13 4 years ago. All right, last 2. Next up we have Matanai. Matanai was my number 12 at the time. I still love this crunchy, fast, eminently replayable, different every time you play it, slugfest of a card game where you have multi-use cards that you can use in a variety of different ways. You have an endless parade of outrageous powers that you have to balance one against the other and try to figure out which power you can get right now and how it will help you the best, and you're trying to build up these combos. It is excellent. It is a small card game, so it's not a huge box or anything, but it's well worth checking out if you get a chance. The learning curve is pretty high. This is a difficult game to learn. I've often had a half an hour teach and then a 20-minute game, because the game itself plays relatively quick once you understand how it works. It's just that to understand how it works is fairly complicated. I really like the online implementations of this. The Yukata.de implementation is very good, and I'll be happy to play Matanai anytime anybody wants to. Head over there and send me an invitation. Wombat929 is my username. Matanai was my number 12 back then. It is my number 27 in my most recent top 50. So it has dropped a bit, but still in very high in my estimation. And since I did that list, I've played hundreds of new games, and so you could see it, Matanai staying buoyant in my estimation there. And finally, the number 11 list on my top 50 was a game at that time I had only played once or maybe twice, and that's A Feast for Odin. Now, Feast for Odin is a fantastic large box experience from Uwe Rosenberg. It's got tons of pieces and lots of different mechanisms going on. It is a feast of mechanisms. It's a feast of gameplay. It's a polyomino game mixed with worker placement, mixed with engine management, and it's just fantastic. Really, really good. The biggest downside for me is just it is really hard to get to the table. I've played it a number of times on Board Game Arena since it showed up there, and so I'm really starting to get the hang of it. But on the table, it's very hard to get there because it just takes forever. It's a very long game. Now, I did recently buy the Norwegians expansion, which I've heard settles some of the things that people see as problems in A Feast for Odin. I would like to say that I've gotten to try that yet. I have not, however, but it's definitely on my list to try sometime soon. Ideally, I could find a couple other people who've played A Feast for Odin before, so I would not have to do a teach, but we'll see. So that's A Feast for Odin. It was my number 11 at the time. It is not in my top 50 now, but it certainly was a close contender. I bet if I had done a top 60, it was there. And the main reason, again, that it's not there is similar to Elysium. I just don't get it played on the table very much because it is very time consuming and it's a beast to play. So that's A Feast for Odin, which was my number 11. And that brings me to the end of the 400 back for episode 454. What were you doing 4 years ago? What were you playing? Were you listening to the podcast yet? Probably not, but if you were, fantastic. What do you think of those games I just talked about? Would they have been in your top 50 4 years ago? Are they in your top 50 today? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know your thoughts. You could also send me a direct message. Wombat929 is my Board Game Geek username. Or you can email me, brendan@rattleboxgames.com. Or reach out to me on one of the asynchronous game platforms, Board Game Arena, yukata.de, or Boitaju. In all three places, I am Wombat929, and I would love to play a game with you. Thanks for joining me on my nostalgic walk today, in which I looked back over 4 years to see what I was doing 4 years ago. I appreciate you joining me, and I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.